So the third panel, the third of four, is focused on leading to create greater impact. I'd soon like to welcome to the stage Hilary Carty. Hilary is the director of the CLORE Leadership Programme and former director of cultural leadership. She's director of the CLORE Leadership Programme, former director of the cultural leadership programme. Sara Wajid, head of engagement at Museum of London, previously head of interpretation, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery right here, and she's also founder of Museum Detox, and we'll be talking a bit about that in a bit. And finally, David Jubb, artistic director and chief executive of Battersea Arts Centre, numerous achievements including an innovative social change programme called The Agency, which I think we might touch on as part of our conversation today. So again, we're going to leap right in. So who better to do that than Sara? There are many areas we could focus on within this topic of leading to create greater impact, I think. But today, I think we'd like to explore Museum Detox, if that's all right. So what was wrong, or what is wrong, that meant you wanted to initiate Museum Detox?
Yeah, always happy to talk about Museum Detox. I suppose what was wrong was I felt I was leaking energy as I was getting more senior in the sector and becoming a manager. There was one very particular day when I was at work and I came out of a meeting and I felt I had to swallow and bite back something I'd wanted to say more clearly, and it was about race relations and representation, and I was the only person of colour in that meeting. And when I came out of the meeting, I realised the white colleague that I'd been talking to had not been leaking energy the way I had. When I came out, I needed a fag. Basically, I was like trembling and angry and raging, but I knew that I had to keep myself in check and be professional. But that the matter in hand, the topic that we'd been talking to, mattered to me in a way that it would never quite matter to him, and my blood was boiling. And when I came out of that meeting, I thought, I am using too much energy. I just spent a lot of energy in there that he's not going to use. He's not going to need to go and have a fag. He's going to go back to his office and crack on with his work and be excellent. And I'm going to be trembling. And I thought, I bet there is someone else, somewhere else in this sector that is having this moment. I bet there is a black worker somewhere in another museum that is feeling like I am feeling today, and I want to talk to them. And so I pretty much just reached out to find other black, Asian, minority, ethnic workers who would meet me in the pub for literally a detox. And that was the first impulse, and that's why we called it Museum Detox, because that was an emotional detox that we felt we needed. And at that time, I think identity politics was very much out of fashion. I had grown up in a culture where I'd been working in the media previously, and I was used to an environment. Thought leaders were the people like Stuart Hall were our touch points, and my mother was a journalist, and she had been in the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, in the Black Workers subcommittee of that, and that was the culture I grew up with, and that seemed very normal for black workers to be organising collectively and there to be solidarity. But by the time it was New Labour moment, that felt very passé. Like that would be really naff to do something like that, because people are so much more than their race. But actually the museum sector was behind enough and old-fashioned enough that I found I did need the same tools as my mother had needed when she was part of the Black Workers subcommittee of the NUJ. Times hadn't changed enough in the museum sector. So that's where that impulse came from, and where the solidarity, I suppose the need for solidarity came from. And to go back to the Stuart Hall point, I think although there were some very significant black, Asian, minority, ethnic leaders in the sector, I wasn't feeling or finding those ideological thought leaders in the way that I was very used to from the culture sector that I'd come from, the wider culture sector, and the people that I knew and were mixing with. And I felt that the workers in the museum sector, risk is a very important part of leadership, and black workers particularly were operating in a context which we couldn't afford risk. We couldn't quite afford risk in the way that really top leaders needed to, because of kind of hyper-surveillance and the underrepresentation. And so I didn't have those go-to people. I couldn't see them in the sector, and that's why we developed them. We found them amongst ourselves through the solidarity of the network.
Brilliant, thank you. And we're going to hear a bit more about that network and how it works and the impact it's had in a little while. But before that, if that's okay, Hilary, you've dedicated a significant amount of your professional life to leadership development within the cultural sector. What are some of the most powerful shifts in leadership that organisations could be considering right now, do you think?
Oh, a small question there.
Yeah.
But I think I'll just pick three of very many. But one of the things that I think is a shift that we need to work with is creating a kind of a positive attitude to change, so that we embrace the fact that things are changing rather than resisting the fact that things are changing. Certainly in the earlier time in my career, we could look at the past in order to plan the future, and that was a nice cyclical thing to do. And actually, at this current time, things are moving so quickly that the data from the past is useful, but it's not quite as critical as it used to be. So having a positive embrace of change, I think, is a shift that's really central. I think the second thing is about uncertainty and being comfortable with just not knowing. Because we just don't know. It's partly about the pace of change. It's partly about so many variables that we're all having to deal with at the moment, that there's so much more that we don't know, even though we're quite experienced and you might be at a senior level. But I think it's okay, because I tell myself nobody else knows either. So there's lots of people that don't know, but that issue of uncertainty can be make you quite hesitant and make you not take the risk that Sara was just talking about. And I think the shift, the final shift that I'd like to suggest is one about how we view our organizations. When we're embracing change, it's a default mechanism to look externally and to bring other people from the outside in. And I would like to advocate that we work from the inside out, that we harness the expertise and the experience that is inherent within our organizations, inherent within the people, and we put them in as part of the critical mix. So that one of the things that I'm doing currently at the CLORE Leadership Program, I've been in post for just 6 months. And of course, I'm wanting to make some shifts and changes. But I think I'm probably external enough for the organization, being new in post. So I'm working with the experience and the expertise of my team. And we're creating what we've called task circles, led by a person within the team, but using a kind of 360 of opinions from the team, from the board, but also from the external perspectives, so that we wrap it around our experience and take the whole thing forward, rather than just something that's coming from the outside.
Thank you very much indeed. So we're coming back to hear some more about some ways in which we can evolve and develop our leadership in a little while. And in the meantime, David, thinking about Battersea Arts Centre and the distinctive organisational and leadership model that you have at BAC, what challenges were you seeking to sort of overcome, and where did you get the inspiration for that distinctive model? Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So when I first started working at Battersea Arts Centre, I think the organisation seemed to me to move quite slowly as an organisation. I found that I'd come from working in very small organisations, and it was up into working in an organisation of about 25, 30 people. And it seemed quite slow, and it seemed quite bureaucratic, and it just seemed like decisions would take an eon. And also people didn't get on very well sometimes as well, which was also concerned me, I guess. I remember I think my second board meeting, maybe third, the chair at the time, Nick Starr, sort of pulled me aside, and I thought, oh, hey, I'm going to get sacked. And it would have been fair, to be honest, in terms of how things have been going. And he just said, you don't have to be, David, you don't have to be so sensible. And it was one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever had. Was because I think the more
you really took it to heart.
Well, yeah, the more I got a hat. The more I thought about it. I guess our organisations often are organised along quite industrial lines. I think a lot of that slowness and staticness in the organisation was based on sort of siloed departmental working, where essentially we're structured, if you think about it, a bit like a kind of light bulb manufacturer from 100 years ago. And actually, when you're dealing with people's imaginations and ideas, the idea that you structure your organisation and make your decisions decisions and have your hierarchies based around function rather than about what you're trying to do, I think that's a really odd way to structure it. An amazing woman called Sara, who was a CLORE fellow who came into our organisation about 5 years ago, had gone off and done her CLORE fellowship with people like Unilever and Mother Advertising, got out of the kind of subsidised arts sector and saw that kind of matrix project working models, which were a lot flatter in terms of the hierarchy, a lot more fluid and flexible and more empowering for the teams that were part of them. And she brought that to Battersea Arts Centre. We knew we wanted to do it, but we didn't know how to do it. But we have this process at Battersea Arts Centre called Scratch, which is a kind of iterative development model where somebody has an idea, you test that idea in some way practically, get a bit of feedback, and then review it. And you just keep doing that until it gets better and better. And it's awful to start with, and it gets better as it goes on. And so that's what we did. We switched the model to project working, but probably over about an 18-month period. And lots of things did go wrong. There was budget control issues, all sorts of kind of management challenges, clarity of line reports and so on. We got so many things wrong. But we did get to a place where I think we now have a much more kind of fluid, flat structure. And the key, I guess, inspiration for that was just to look at our creative programme. Because I think arts organisations often, sort of the organisation can sometimes feel different to the work. And Sara brought this great provocation in, which was how can we make the organisation as creative as the work is? And so we took that on.
Beautiful, thank you. So, Sara, I wanted to hear a bit more about Museum Detox. I think we all do. And to hear a bit about the impact that Museum Detox is having, perhaps on some particular heritage professionals and how this impact's come about. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it has been incredibly satisfying to see the development, particularly of emerging professionals and some of the younger museum workers who I've met through the network. And I suppose it's come about because that solidarity that I was talking about gives people a confidence and a swagger. I'll give you an example. When we went collectively to the Museum Next conference in Rotterdam last summer, there was about 20 of us were part of the delegation. And we're very visible in museum conferences, much like this. You probably won't see that many Black, Asian, minority ethnic people in the delegates, amongst the delegates. And so when you get 25, mainly stunning, I must say, extremely well-dressed museum workers collectively there and making their presence felt through their speeches, their talks, their tweets, it really changed the dynamic, not just of the conversation at the conference, and that's a massive international conference, but it also meant that international workers, Americans, Europeans, all sorts of international workers, were looking at British museum sector differently because we were pretty much representing the British museum sector as a cohort, and that knock-on then had an effect on the delegates who were there. I remember one of the youngest members of that network saying she was just about to join, sort of just about to get her first job in the sector, and she said, "This has just been phenomenal. This is just not the sector. This is not what I understood of the sector." And it's given her a swagger and a sort of an ability to apply for jobs that I don't think she would have had if not for the network. There's 2 people from Museum Detox now on the board of trustees of the Museums Association. All sorts of things like that I'm seeing. People applying for jobs, applying for trustee roles that they wouldn't have necessarily otherwise reached for. And I think intellectually, there's also been a movement around decolonising museums that has developed in the last couple of years that has been really interesting because people are talking, as you were saying, about silos and matrix management. People are talking to people from different specialisms in a very different way. So there's 108 people on that list in the network, and many of them are from different specialisations. So you get a natural sciences curator spending we did a retreat in archaeological dig last summer, spending the weekend with somebody who curates a very different type of collection, also a history of science collection, but very different type, talking about their shared interest in scientific racism in their collections. Now, when they had that conversation strolling down a beach in Suffolk, that was a moment of intellectual sort of a synergy that would never have happened in a meeting or some other conventional setting, and they then were able to develop their thinking on decolonising history of science and write a paper together and then share that paper at the Natural Sciences Curators Network and a conference, which then had an impact on that network. I'll talk about the past is now, perhaps in my next answer if I'm going to get another question. Am I going to get another question? I'll get another question. I'll save it till then.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Hilary, CLORE's done some research into the need and the impact of leadership development and governance. What does that tell us about the benefits we might be missing out on if we're not focusing our attention in those areas as leaders in this room?
Sure.
Right.
I think grounding our work in research is something that has been at the heart of CLORE. The programme itself started following some research way back in the early 2000s, which looked at what was happening in our cultural institutions and how could we better nurture and support leaders, both that were in post but also coming through. And we've maintained that tradition. So a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we commissioned some leadership surveys which were looking at what's the current issues for leaders who are in post. And we took that research into our program, so we adjusted our fellowship program, we adjusted our intensive courses to make sure that we were actually learning with the sector and equipping our cultural leaders to be able to be a more effective part of the sector. The most recent research that we've done is actually in the field of governance. And it's really looking at what are the current issues, what's at the top of the agenda for people who are in that critical area of senior leadership. And I was delighted to work with a couple of colleagues, David Bryan and Anne Murch, who are themselves embedded within sector practice, to be able to deliver that. So we were talking about the issues of strategic discussions, making sure that there is the time and space within board organisations to have that far-reaching long-term discussion, as well as dealing with the here and now. Making sure that issues such as fundraising are addressed. We've heard earlier this morning about the challenges of diversity, and diversifying boards is one of those topical issues that really, really needs to be tackled. But beyond that, we also came up with some recommendations which were about what do we do about it? How can we create the space within our organisations to be learning organisations to make sure that we are tackling those governance issues? And as CLORE Leadership Programme, we then commissioned Pruskin, our governance associate, and a couple of other colleagues to write what we call the practical guide. And in that practical guide, you will find the tools, the tips, and the techniques, which are about whether it's board reviews or board induction or diversity, really getting to grips with managing our organisations. If I can just squeeze in one more, what I'm really excited about at the moment is a movement that we're creating around a governance alliance. And that's an alliance of sector organisations who are working collectively to tackle the issue of governance, to make sure that whether you're working in theatre or music or museums, we, by working together as sector organisations, can provide a more ready-to-market, as it were, response to the issues, to the needs, so that you can actually go to the Alliance. We will be eventually creating a portal so that you can go there and you can find out a wealth of information to support your learning and practice in terms of governing our organisations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, David, earlier on you were talking about Scratch informing your organisational design and thinking differently about how you do the work of making work, how you run the organisation. And I know that that's now also informed the way that you work with communities. So what difference has that sort of Scratch model made to the way that you work outside of the building with young people or community groups that you're engaging with right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed it a lot. I mean, look, this is very similar to what Tony was talking about earlier in terms of human-centered design. There are so many different names for these different models. It's basically another word for talking to people and having a conversation and working out what you might do together. And I feel that that's all it is, really. I don't have an answer that's longer than that. I just think that, that is it.
I really like that, and I really like the sense that when we talked before, I really like the sense that you talked about kind of being a producer first, and the role of the producer to enable others' creativity and innovation, and there's a generosity that you can bring to your engagements. There's a way of listening and enabling that you can bring to your engagement.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the job of a producer is to support other people's ideas, and I guess that's what I see the role of our organisation is to support other people's ideas. And I think it was a kind of only a skip and a hop and a jump between recognising that we were working with artists to scratch and develop and support their ideas, to thinking, well, why aren't we doing that with everyone? Why aren't we kind of doing that with all members of our community? You know, have you got an idea? You mentioned the agency earlier on, which is just an idea about working with young people who are living on local housing estates who might not have an automatic route into our building, and to say to them, what's your idea and how can we help you develop it? I guess the difference is it's about, you know, it's less about arts. It's more about using creativity to help people reach their potential. And I think our job as arts and cultural organisations and museums, we're good kind of resources full of kind of good creative process. That's what we have. And I think rather than thinking that we've got to make and create and produce and kind of like we're some sort of car manufacturer all the time, I think we can think about how we can enable and support other people's ideas.
Thank you. And Sara, you were kind of hoping that you might have another chance to talk some more about the impact of Museum Detox. And I think I wanted to hear you, perhaps if you can, talk a little bit for us about the institutional impact and, you know, maybe what you'd call on CEOs and chairs to do if they're inspired by the model that you've talked about today.
Yeah, I think talking to people is a beautiful way to sum that up. And Museum Detox enabled me when I was at Birmingham Museum Art Gallery this last year, I think the museum with the most culturally diverse workforce in the country, to talk to people differently. So there I was essentially a producer, a kind of producer-curator, if you want, of an experimental exhibition which sought to find new ways of thinking about legacies of empire, find a new interpretive voice that would better represent the young multicultural citizenry of Birmingham. And it was partly because of my Museum Detox network that I kind of, and the ethos that I brought to my role that year as Arts Council sponsored Changemaker. I was on the Changemakers programme at Birmingham. That meant that talking to people, I was talking to the cultural activists that were the co-curators of the work that we were making. The exhibition was co-curated with 6 Birmingham-based Black and Asian women who are all cultural activists. Very, very talented team of women that I think I would only have met here in Birmingham. But the terms of engagement were very different because I was sort of meeting them as a worker, a museum worker, but I was also meeting them as a museum activist. So there was some sort of solidarity and shared ground, I like to think, on that basis. And also because I was representing Birmingham Museum Art Gallery and the exhibition was happening there, and absolutely it was a Birmingham Museum Art Gallery exhibition, but it was also one that was very informed by Museum Detox practitioners and the network. And so the people that I was working with, they came as well to Rotterdam, for instance, and so they were able to meet the other Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers who were also interested in these same decolonising ideas. So institutionally, that changed the conversation that was being had at Birmingham. It changed the language, and I think the way that people talk about race within Birmingham Museum Art Gallery. Although there is a high representation of Birmingham in the museum of Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers compared to most museums, the way that you talk about race really matters in the cultural DNA of an organisation. There can be a lot of black workers in a place, but if the conversations between black and between white workers and every which way around isn't happening in a way that is honest, and real talk isn't happening, and you kind of need those cultural activists to come into the organisation and be treated as equals for that real talk to really happen. That's when I think we saw a step change, and the exhibition then sparked a step change, I think, and the rest of the sector has been extremely curious about the exhibition. I encourage you all to go and see it. It's Birmingham Museum Art Gallery is just a short walk from here. And this evening when I leave here, I will be going to talk programmed by those cultural activists who co-curated the exhibition, where they have invited the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, to talk at Impact Hub, and I will be going there to learn from them. So really that culture of activism within Museum Detox then informs the sector and institutional change and better serves audiences ultimately, and comes back to that point about talking, but what are the power, what are the terms of engagements when you talk to people as from an institutional base? They have to be different in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're about a minute from the end of this session, sadly. So not only do you not get a minute to answer this time, you get 20 seconds. So Hilary, could you just give us a really quick sense of what provision there is for formal sort of leadership, exec and governance development out there in a flash?
Okay, well, if I have one flash, I'll say that we are running chair and CEO days. I mean, this is a perfect audience for it, so I couldn't leave the stage without saying that. We have one tomorrow. But if you look on our website, CLOREleadership.org, we are also running more chair and CEO learning days in June, July, and September, and one which is about diversifying boards in February next year. And that's an opportunity not just to sort of listen and hear in this format, but to actually bring the issues that you are working with within your organizations and work through those, both with colleagues from different organizations and with our governance associates. So that's one sort of formal offer that I'm sorry I could not plug.
No, quite right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found the conversation that we've had here on the panel as extraordinary as it's felt for me. It's a fantastic description of radical achievability built on deep insights and experience and values, applied in practical and progressive ways. Again, if you'd like to know more about these organisations and the leaders you've heard from today, then access the conference website to read their case studies, find links alongside the others. We also commissioned case studies in this topic from Arnold Feeney and Contact Theatre, so you'll find those there too. I should also mention that we've created a directory of the sector support organisations for the conference. So if you don't use any of those sector support organisations to date, then have a look at those on the website, and they're describing the ways in which they can help you, the ways in which they're funded to help you to create some of the kinds of changes that we've been hearing about from this panel. But right now, it's time for me to thank Hilary, Sara and David for their extraordinary contribution. Thank you very much.